Hello. Welcome back to our channel. Here's a follow-up on our initial video on photography tips for all kinds of photography. Photography tip 41. Play around with different shutter speeds. Playing around with shutter speeds can help you create some mesmerizing effects that would intrigue your audience. So, when you take your nighttime shot, work with a tripod, and try working with a 4-second shutter speed. This way, you capture the movement of the object, but you also capture some light trails alongside, which can be really beautiful. A faster shutter speed, on the other hand, like 1/400th of a second, for example, would freeze motion. So, though trails might appear, they won't be as bright or as long as with a slower shutter speed. You can also try shooting all kinds of moving objects and backgrounds at different shutter speeds just to create different effects, from blurring movements to freezing action in time. Now, remember that we slow shutter speeds down in order to blur movements. As such, you should be wary of camera shake so the photo is not blurrier than necessary. Again, get a tripod. Photography tip 42. When in the digital darkroom, remember that the photo rules. The reason many photographers find using post-processing software difficult to use is because they've been taught to focus on the software rather than the photography. But like we have highlighted, the photo rules, and should always rule. You know why you took that photo. So, let your photographic intent guide you when you do your edits. Be focused on the craft rather than the technology. Don't learn the how before the why. Also, don't be afraid to experiment with your photos fearlessly. Drop the caution at the door and experiment a little. There's always the undo button if all doesn't go as planned. Photography tip 43. Simplicity is key. Too many details in one picture are distracting to the viewer and make it difficult to create an appealing composition. What you really need, most times, is one interesting subject alone. It's always a lot easier to make a great composition when you have just one subject to work with. Don't be too bothered that there's so much empty space in your photo. This is known as negative space and helps your subject stand out. In fact, knock out all distractions in your scene before you take the photo. Also, a minimalist composition is much better when you're sharing on Instagram. This is because simpler photos have better chances of standing out on a phone's smaller screen than overtly complex ones. Photography tip 44. Shoot at an angle lower than chest level. When shooting with an iPhone, the easiest angle to shoot from is chest height. It is quite convenient, which is why most people just shoot from there without thinking. However, there are more creative angles from which you can take photos using your iPhone. One of the best angles you can shoot from is from a lower angle, and here are 3 reasons why. First, photos taken from a lower angle are more intriguing as they show you the world from a fresh perspective. Secondly, with a lower angle, the only background you'd be working with is the big blue sky. So, you have fewer distractions to deal with and your subject can truly stand out. Third, when you shoot from a lower angle, you get to show off all the interesting details the foreground has to offer. So, when next time you're taking a landscape photo, consider shooting from a lower angle. This way, you could include the flowers or the water reflections in the foreground. Don't be shy to kneel or even lie down for the ultimate shot. Photography tip 45. Show some depth. A sense of depth always helps to make a better photo as it draws the eye of your viewer into your scene. You'd need this tip especially when doing landscapes. One technique you can use to this is to use the power of leading lines while composing your scene for a photo. Let the line lead starting at the foreground and then into the distance. The line draws your viewer in and, thereby, creates a more engaging photo. You can also do this by including other interesting things in the foreground like flowers, leaves, rocks, or other interesting things you might find. If this feels like a struggle, then try lowering your angle just a little bit. The middle ground and background shouldn't be left behind too. Including subjects in the foreground, middle ground and background will give your photo a more 3-dimensional look that you'd love. Another way to create depth is to frame the scene using a subject in the foreground. Archways, overhanging branches, and window frames qualify as great framing objects. When you shoot through a frame, attention is automatically drawn to the beyond through the frame, which evokes a strong feeling of depth. Photography tip 46. Get closer. When photographing objects with intricacies, it is important to get closer to the subject so you can capture all the detail. Colors, textures, patterns, leaves, flowers, water droplets, all these come to life when you dare to inch closer to the object. Another kind of photography that would benefit from this technique is portrait photography. In portraits, the emotions and facial features of the subject are important details you want to capture in your subjects when taking portraits, whether it's a person or a pet. Now, when taking portraits with your iPhone, you want to remember that the native lens of your iPhone can't exactly focus well if they are too close to the subject. To be able to focus well enough to get all the intricate detail, you'd need to get an additional macro lens. There are many macro lenses you can get, but two of the most popular options are the Moment and Olloclip macro lenses. Landscape photos might be distant, but including a close-up detail won't hurt too. You can include that in the foreground to create some sense of depth. Photography tip 47. Shoot silhouettes. You know what a silhouette is: dark shape, bright light. They are always eye-catching and quite simple to take. So, how do you do that with your iPhone? Simple. Get something interesting to shoot, then shoot facing the light. To make your results more stunning and dark, set the iPhone focus in your camera app. Then darken exposure by swiping down. If that's not enough and you want to darken the silhouette further, you can do that. Edit the photo with any good editing app. For the best silhouette shots, utilize the golden hour we talked about earlier. This will give you an amazing colored sky as background. You can also take silhouette photos indoors as well by placing the subject either in front of a lamp or in front of a window. Photography tip 48. Include some shadows in your compositions. You can include shadows to give your photos an intriguing or mysterious feel. Shadows are attractive and interesting. They are also useful as they can function as leading lines as well. Again, just like silhouettes, shadows are best shot in the golden hour when the shadows are longest. You can use the tip we shared with the silhouettes to darken the shadows. So, look out for interesting patterns to make your photos more interesting. Whether you choose to photograph the subject and the shadow or the shadow alone, shadows are always a nice angle to work. Photography tip 49. Reflections are nice too. We've seen that reflections are nice elements to include in your photos, and the same applies to iPhone photography. To add extra dimension to a water reflection, for instance, you can add ripples and waves to produce a distortion for a beautiful effect. You can also include the subject and its reflection for an even stronger impact. Just pay attention and you'll notice reflections wherever you go, which you can include in your photos. Photography tip 50. Work with symmetry. Make it a point to find symmetrical images everywhere you find yourself. They make for really striking images. Then when composing your shot, make it such that the two halves of the picture are almost identical, at least. You can also create symmetry with reflections by simply creating a line of symmetry dead center. Architectural pieces are naturally symmetrical as well. Now, we know that, according to the rule of thirds, it's advised to move your subject off center. But, once in a while, it's okay to set your subject in the center to create some semblance of symmetry. Photography tip 51. Try diagonal balance. To create some form of harmony and balance in your photos, you can try for diagonal balance. This works really nicely when there are two or more than two subjects in your scene. It makes it easier for your viewers to flow with your scene. On the other hand, keeping everything on one side would make your image appear a bit unbalanced. But what do you do if the objects in your scene are unmovable? Like when you're taking a landscape photo, for instance. Remember the move your feet rule, yes. Here is the time to apply it. Move around until you can find an angle where the objects in the scene appear in a diagonal alignment. Photography tip 52. Use VSCO filters when you edit. For more stunning photos, you'd have to step up your editing game using VSCO filters. These filters are beautiful yet understated. Even though they aren't exactly beginner-level editing, they are not quite as complex as more advanced software like Photoshop. So, they are, generally, easy to use. Now, the subtleness of the VSCO filters could be the undoing of many photographers because it's quite easy to overdo it. So, you have to be careful. Other than that, the VSCO app comes with loads of free preset filters and you can even download it for free. If you want to go hardcore, though, there are more sophisticated tools on the app which you can use. You can also use the tip on leading lines to create that diagonal alignment as well. Like with reflections and symmetrical images, you want to be on the lookout for subjects in diagonal alignments. The more you can identify them, the more you'd be able to. Photography tip 53. Hold your iPhone like a camera. When taking your photos with your iPhone, learn to hold it like a camera, not just like a phone that has a camera. So, the screen is your viewfinder and you look into your viewfinder, not past the phone, to take a photo. Photography tip 54. Zoom in with your feet, not the camera. Don't ever zoom in by dialing in the zoom function. If you want to get closer, move your feet. Even a little bit of zooming when shooting with an iPhone often results in a pixelated and grainy image. So, you want to avoid that. Photography tip 55. Check your settings, set them on high. This one is quite straight to the point, right? Photography tip 56. Clean your lenses. Your phone is everywhere from your bag to your back pocket. So, it's inevitable that the lens would get dirty at some point. Ensure that you clean it often. Photography tip 57. Make plans beyond checking the weather. Sure, you'd have to check the weather, but for the best landscape photos, you have to make your plans like a pro. Here are some other things to check that would help you prepare like an experienced photographer. You could look out for the sun sets or rises in the location you have picked out. You also want to find out what direction exactly the sun faces when it rises or falls to help you make a desirable shooting position. This might seem like a lot, especially for a noob, but we can thank heavens for technology. These days, there are apps that do literally everything. One of the most useful ones is the Photographer's Ephemeris. This app works with Google Maps and can give you nearly all the information you'd possibly need while planning for your landscape shoot. To use the smartphone app, you'd have to pay a small subscription fee, but trust us when we say that it's totally worth it. Photography tip 58. Use wide-angle lenses. In truth, you should let the subject and location determine the technique as well as the focal length you use for each shoot. However, from experience, you begin to find that every landscape photographer would benefit from including ultra-wide-angle lenses to their kit bag. So, if you're using an APS-C, consider a 10 to 20 mm focal range. If full frame, you'll be able to take really stunning photos with a wide field of view using lenses with a focal range of about 15 to 30 mm. Photography tip 59. Travel light to the degree that you conveniently can. You're probably going to have walk a ways to get to the precise spot in your location where you want to take your photos. So, it's just common sense to travel light. Pack what you need alone. Don't pack 4 lenses if you need 3, these things add up. But then again, you don't want to forget the essentials. Some of these essentials, like spare batteries, filters, lens cleaning materials, as well as weather-appropriate clothing, could make all the difference. Don't leave home without them. Photography tip 60. Set up properly. When it comes to landscapes, camera settings are hardly ever complicated. Usually, you'd shoot in aperture priority mode. This gives you a good level of control over the depth of field of your photo while allowing the camera select the right shutter speed. So, you want to set your aperture to f/16 to create that large depth of field, and then set the ISO to 100 so image quality is sharp. Metering mode should be at evaluative matrix so that the camera reads light from every area of the scene. This will help the camera to calculate and give the image the right exposure. But if that doesn't work for you, you can always darken or lighten the exposure by using exposure compensation. Now, all these settings plus filters in front of your lens can add up to slow down shutter speed. So, if you find that your shutter speed drops to below 1/25 of a second, you might want to use a tripod. Do this while using a remote to trigger the shutter rather than using your fingers. You're doing this to avoid camera shake, which could lead to blurry photos. If you've enjoyed this video, click the subscribe button below and hit the notification bell so you'll know once we post a new video. Also drop a comment below so we can know your thoughts. Finally, don't forget to check the description below for more details and visit our site, www.what-camera.com, for more awesome camera content like this.